The year was 2347, and humanity had finally reached the stars, but the stars were not empty as they had hoped. 300 years ago, the first signal came from deep space, and everything changed forever. The hegemony made contact with Earth, and humans learned a terrible truth about the universe. They were not special, they were not advanced, and they were certainly not alone. The galaxy was filled with thousands of alien species, and all of them looked down at humanity like adults look at small children trying to join a game they cannot understand. The hegemony was ruled by the Valthari, an ancient race of beings who could read minds, move objects with thought, and bend reality itself with their psionic powers. They had conquered the galaxy not with weapons, but with the sheer force of their minds. No species could hide secrets from them, no army can stand against their mental attacks, and no leader could resist their influence. They were gods in all but name, and the galaxy knelt before them. Humanity was classified as a Class 7 primitive species, which meant they were barely worth noticing. They had no psionic abilities at all, not even the smallest spark of mental power. Every human tested came back negative, and the Valthari laughed at these strange creatures who stumbled through life, completely blind to the psychic energy that flowed through all living things. On a dusty border world called Nexus 9, far from Earth and far from anywhere important, a man named Elias Vance woke up to another difficult day. He was 34 years old, with tired eyes and rough hands from years of hard work. He had been a construction worker back on Earth before the integration, building homes and offices and all the things people needed. Now, he ran a refugee camp for humans who had lost everything when the hegemony decided their colony worlds were needed for more important species. Elias splashed water on his face and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. He saw nothing special, just an ordinary man with ordinary brown hair and ordinary features that no one would remember 5 minutes after meeting him. He had no special talents, no military training, no advanced degrees. He was exactly what the Valthari said all humans were, unremarkable and insignificant. But he got up every morning anyway, because people needed him. The camp held 3,000 refugees, humans who had been pushed off their homes and left to survive on this harsh world. Elias made sure they had food and water and medicine. He settled disputes and comforted crying children and helped old people find shelter from the burning sun. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. His wife Maria would have been proud of him, he thought. She had died during the integration 5 years ago, when hegemony soldiers cleared their colony to make room for a Valthari meditation center. She had been trying to help a family escape when the building collapsed. Elias had not been there to save her, and that guilt lived in his chest like a stone he could never remove. He worked harder because of her. He helped others because she would have wanted him to. It was all he had left. That morning, a message arrived that would change everything. The High Council of Earth sent urgent communications to every human settlement. The alien queen, High Sovereign Yizareth of the Valthari, had announced something called the Tribunal of Worth. It was an ancient tradition that all new species had to complete. Each species joining the hegemony had to send their single most exceptional individual to demonstrate their value. This champion would face tests of mind and body and spirit. If they impressed the tribunal, humanity would be granted full membership with rights and protections. If they failed, humanity would be designated a servitor species. Servitor species were slaves in all but name, forced to work for other races with no rights and no hope of freedom. Elias had seen them in the cities, beings with dead eyes who had given up on life because life had nothing to offer them anymore. Earth could not let that happen. The government launched the biggest search in human history. They tested athletes and soldiers and scientists and artists. They measured intelligence and strength and creativity and courage. They scanned millions of people, looking for anyone who might have even a trace of psionic potential. The fate of 8 billion humans rested on finding one exceptional person. In a small office on Nexus 9, a board clerk made a terrible mistake. The computer showed 2 names, Elias Vance and Elias Vance Torres. The second man was a decorated military commander with dozens of medals and years of combat experience. He was strong and smart and brave, exactly the kind of champion humanity needed. The clerk meant to select him for transport to the throne world. But the clerk was tired, and the names looked so similar, and with one wrong click, the wrong Elias received the summons. Elias was in the middle of fixing a broken water pump when the soldiers arrived. They told him he had been selected for a great honor, and that he must come with them immediately. He tried to explain that there must be some mistake, that he was nobody important, but they would not listen. Orders were orders, and they had a schedule to keep. Before he could even say goodbye to his people, Elias found himself on a ship heading to the throne world, the center of the entire hegemony, and home to the alien queen herself. The ship was filled with champions from other species, beings of incredible power and ability. One could see the future with perfect clarity. Another could survive in the vacuum of space without any protection. A third could phase through solid matter like a ghost. They looked at Elias with confusion and pity, wondering what possible value this small human could offer. Elias wondered the same thing. The throne world was beautiful and terrifying. Great towers of crystal reached toward the sky, built not with machines, but with pure thought. The air hummed with psionic energy that made Elias feel slightly sick, though he did not know why. Millions of beings from thousands of species filled the streets, all of them more impressive than him in every way. He was led to the tribunal grounds, a massive arena that could hold 100,000 spectators. The champions lined up before a stage where the judges sat, ancient Valfari, with eyes that seemed to look through everything. And then Queen Yizareth appeared. She was tall and slender, with skin like polished silver, and eyes that burned with inner fire. She radiated power like heat from a sun, and every being in the arena felt her presence press against their minds. She had not attended a tribunal in 3,000 years, but something had drawn her here today. The moment Elias stepped onto the sacred ground, something strange happened. Every psionic being in the arena staggered as if struck. The judges gasped and grabbed their heads. Queen Yizareth sat forward on her throne, her burning eyes fixed on the ordinary human who stood confused among the champions. She could read every mind in the galaxy. She could taste every soul and know every secret. But when she reached for this human, she found nothing. Not resistance, not shields, but absolute emptiness. He was a hole in the fabric of reality, a void where a person should be. For the first time in 10,000 years, High Sovereign Yizareth felt something she had forgotten existed. The weeks that followed the ceremony were unlike anything Elias had ever experienced, and he found himself caught in a web of political intrigue that grew more tangled with each passing day. It started with the whispers and the stares whenever he walked through the corridors of Convergence Prime, and then came the messages and the invitations and the requests for private meetings from representatives of species he had never even heard of before. A merchant prince from the Cathari Collective offered him a small fortune in exchange for the secret of what he had done to the princess. And when Elias explained that he did not know any secret, the merchant laughed and said that he admired a human who could bargain so well. A military commander from the Thraken Empire cornered him in a corridor and warned him that whatever weapon he had used against the Valanthi mind would be discovered and countered. And when Elias tried to explain that there was no weapon, simply smiled with too many teeth and walked away. The messages from Earth were even worse, because his superiors demanded explanations that he could not give. And they warned him that humanity's position in the Concord had become unstable because of the incident. and they ordered him to fix the situation without telling him how. Elias realized that he needed answers, not just for himself, but for his entire species, and so he began to research the Volanthi with an obsession that consumed his every waking hour. He read everything he could find in the station's vast library archives, and he spoke with scholars and diplomats and traders who had dealt with the Volanthi over the centuries, and slowly he began to piece together a picture of the most mysterious species in the galaxy. The Volanthi were touch telepaths, he learned, which meant that physical contact allowed them to sense and absorb the emotions of other beings. Permanent transfer that stayed with them forever. When a Volanthi touched another creature and felt its emotions, those feelings became part of the Volanthi's own mind and memory, impossible to forget or ignore. And this was why they avoided physical contact with other species, and why they valued emotional control above all else. They considered feelings to be a kind of contamination, Elias realized, a primitive weakness that polluted the pure logic they believed was the highest form of consciousness. And they had spent millions of years learning to suppress and control their own emotions, to avoid being overwhelmed by the feelings they absorbed from others. This explained why the princess was called the Frozen Star, and why showing emotion was considered such a scandal among her people. But it did not explain why a simple human gesture had affected her so deeply. Elias dug deeper into the archives and searched for any connection between the Volanthi and humanity. And what he found made his blood run cold. There were gaps in the records, he noticed, places where information should have been but had been removed or classified at the highest levels. And all of these gaps seemed to cluster around events that had occurred approximately 150 years ago. He found references to something called the Emotional Integration Studies, a secret Volanthi research program that had been shut down and erased from official history. And he found mentions of young Volanthi subjects who had been exposed to primitive species as part of some kind of experiment. And then late one night, when Elias was alone in his quarters, reviewing data on his terminal, a message arrived from an unknown sender, with no return address and no identification. The message contained only a few words and a set of coordinates, and the words said that if he wanted to know the truth about the princess and the humans, he should come alone and tell no one. Elias knew it could be a trap, but he also knew that he had no other leads to follow, so he made his way through the station's back corridors to a small cargo bay in a section that seemed to have been abandoned long ago. A figure waited for him in the shadows, a Volanthi with gray skin and tired eyes, who wore the simple clothes of a worker rather than the elaborate robes of nobility. The Volanthi introduced himself as Keth Moran, and said that he had once served in the royal household before he had been exiled for asking too many questions. And he told Elias that he had information about the princess that no one else would share. He spoke of the emotional integration studies and confirmed that the princess had been one of the young subjects chosen to participate. And he said that the purpose of the program had been to study how Volanthi minds reacted to the emotions of primitive species. But then Keth Moran said something that made Elias's heart stop beating for a moment. 152 years ago, the defector whispered, a human colony ship called the ESS Meridian had entered Volanthi space by accident while traveling through an unmapped region of the galaxy. And the ship had carried 3,000 human colonists who were searching for a new world to call home. The official records said that the Meridian had suffered a catastrophic engine failure, and that all hands had been lost before rescue ships could arrive. And for 152 years, that had been the only story anyone knew. But Keth Moran told Elias that the official records were lies, and he said that the truth about the Meridian had been buried so deep that even most Volanthi did not know what really happened. There had been one survivor, the defector said, a human child who had somehow lived through the disaster and been found drifting in the wreckage by a Volanthi search team, and the young Princess Ciravel had been present. When the child was discovered, Elias felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together in his mind, even as new questions arose to take the place of the old ones. And he asked Kethmaran what had happened to the human child and why this had been kept secret for so long. The defector shook his head sadly and said that he did not know all the answers. But he gave Elias a data chip that contained fragments of classified files he had managed to copy before his exile. He warned Elias to be careful, because the Volanthi High Council would do anything to keep this secret buried. After the defector slipped away into the darkness, Elias returned to his quarters and spent the rest of the night studying the files on the data chip. What he found there confirmed his worst fears and raised new terrors he had never imagined. The child had died, the files suggested. But before she died, she had come into contact with the young princess, and whatever had passed between them, in those final moments, had been so significant that the entire incident had been classified at the highest levels and erased from history. Elias stared at the data on his screen and thought about what it meant, and he realized that the princess had been carrying something inside her for 152 years. Something human, something that she had never been able to forget or escape. And now, he understood why his gesture had affected her so deeply, because somewhere in her ancient mind was the memory of a human child who had known that same gesture, and seeing it again, after all those years, had broken through the walls she had spent a century and a half building. The question now was what he would do with this knowledge, and whether the princess would be willing to tell him the rest of the story that the files had only hinted at. Elias made his decision and began to compose a formal request for a private audience with the heir to the Volanthi throne, knowing that he was about to step into dangerous territory from which there might be no return. The princess agreed to meet with him, and Elias was surprised by how quickly the response came, because he had expected to wait weeks or even months for an audience with the heir to the Volanthi throne. Instead, he received the summons within 2 days, and he was escorted through corridors he had never seen before to a private chamber deep within the Volanthi section of the station, where no human had ever been permitted to enter. The room was cold and dark, and filled with strange plants that gave off a faint silver glow, and at the center of the room the princess sat upon a simple chair that looked nothing like a throne, but somehow seemed more regal than any golden seat could have been. She watched him enter with those violet eyes that seemed to see straight through him, and her face was as blank and perfect as a mask carved from ice, and Elias felt the weight of her 200 years pressing down upon him as he approached. He bowed in the formal Volanthi manner that he had learned from his research, and the princess acknowledged him with the smallest inclination of her head, before gesturing for him to sit in the chair that had been placed across from her. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched between them like a vast ocean that neither knew how to cross, and Elias could hear nothing but his own breathing and the faint hum of the station systems far away. Then the princess spoke in that voice like cracking ice, and asked him why he had requested this meeting, and Elias knew that the time for careful diplomacy had passed, and that only the truth would serve him now. He told her about his research, and the gaps in the records, and the defector who had contacted him. And he watched her face for any reaction as he spoke, but her expression never changed. And then he mentioned the ESS Meridian and the human child who had survived the disaster, and the princess went very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness, a frozen quality that seemed to radiate outward from her like cold spreading across a window. She asked him how he had learned about this, and her voice was quiet, but carried an edge that Elias had not heard before, and he realized that he had touched something that she had kept hidden for more than a century. Elias told her that it did not matter how he had learned the truth, but only that he wanted to understand what had really happened, and why a simple gesture had caused her to react the way she did at the ceremony. For a long time, the princess did not respond, and Elias began to wonder if she would simply order him removed from her presence and have the whole matter buried once again. But then, something changed in her eyes, a flicker of something ancient and painful that passed across her face so quickly he almost missed it. And when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer somehow, as if the ice had begun to appear back. Crack. She told him that she would share the truth with him, but she warned him that the truth was heavier than he could imagine, and that once he knew it, he would carry it with him forever, just as she had carried it for 152 years. And then Princess Cyravel began to tell the story that she had never told anyone, the memory that had haunted her for longer than most species existed. And as she spoke, Elias felt himself transported back to a time when the princess was young, and the universe was a different place. She had been barely 40 years old in Volanthi terms, which meant she was still considered a child by her people. And she had been chosen along with other young Volanthi to participate in a study of primitive emotions. The researchers wanted to understand how Volanthi minds processed the feelings of lesser species, and they had arranged for controlled contact with various beings from across the galaxy, always careful and clinical. Cold. P. But then the Meridian had entered their space, and everything had changed. P. The ship had not suffered an engine failure, the princess admitted, but had been destroyed by Volanthi weapons after the High Council decided that the humans posed too great a risk to be allowed to leave. The researchers had discovered something terrifying about human emotions, she explained, something that made the Council believe that humanity was too dangerous to be permitted contact with other telepathic species. Human feelings were too strong, too intense, too overwhelming for Volanthi minds to process safely, and the Council feared that prolonged exposure to humans could permanently damage the emotional control that their species had spent millions of years developing. So they had ordered the Meridian destroyed, and all evidence of its existence erased, and they had believed that the matter was settled, and that no one would ever know what they had done. Counted on the child. A little girl named Maya had somehow survived the destruction of the ship, protected by emergency pod that had carried her away from the explosion, and she had been found drifting in the debris by a search team that included the young princess. The girl was dying, the princess said, her voice growing thick with something that might have been grief if Volanthi were capable of such things, and she was alone and terrified and crying out for someone to help her. And even though she had been taught all her life to avoid contact with primitive species, even though she knew the dangers of emotional contamination, the young Cyravel could not bear to let the child die alone in the cold darkness of space. So she had taken the girl in her arms and held her close, and in that moment the flood of human emotion had poured into her mind like a river of fire and light, and she had felt things that no Volanthi had ever felt before. Princess whispered, not just pain or sadness, but love, a love so fierce and bright and overwhelming that it had shattered every wall she had ever built and remade her from the inside out. Them for over a century, and for 3 seconds she had been back in that emergency pod, holding a dying child who was thinking of her father. The princess fell silent, and Elias saw that her hands were trembling slightly, and that her violet eyes were bright with something that looked like tears, even though Volanthi were not supposed to be able to cry. And then for the first time in 152 years, the frozen star allowed herself to weep for the human child she had held as death claimed her. And Elias sat in silence and witnessed something that no one in the galaxy had ever seen. The princess wept not from weakness, but from the weight of carrying a love that was not her own, for longer than any being should have to bear. And Elias understood at last why his people's emotions had been deemed so dangerous. Because human love was not a weakness to be controlled or a contamination to be feared, but a force so powerful that it could crack the ice around even the coldest heart and remind the oldest soul in the galaxy what it meant to feel alive. After the princess finished her story, Elias sat in the cold silver light of her chambers and felt the weight of what he had learned pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. 3,000 human beings had been murdered 152 years ago, not because of anything they had done, but because of what they were. Because their capacity for love and hope and joy had been judged too dangerous to be allowed to exist. And the sane government that had ordered that massacre was now part of the galactic concord that humanity had just joined. Smiling and welcoming them while hiding the blood on their hands beneath robes of silk and ceremony. Elias asked the princess if anyone else knew the truth about what had happened to the Meridian, and she shook her head slowly and said that the secret had been kept by the High Council alone, and that even most Valanthi believed the official story of the engine failure. Something that made the situation even more complicated and dangerous. The High Council had not changed their opinion about humanity in the century and a half since the massacre, she explained, and they still believed that human emotions were a threat to Valanthi mental stability. They had agreed to allow humanity into the Concord only because they could not oppose it without revealing their reasons, and they had been watching and waiting for any excuse to have the humans removed or neutralized. The incident at the ceremony had alarmed them greatly, the princess admitted, because it had proven that even after all this time, human feelings could still affect Valanthi minds in ways that could not be controlled or predicted. Elias realized with a cold certainty that he and his entire species were in danger, and he asked the princess what she thought the council would do now that their fears had been confirmed. She told him that she did not know for certain, that she suspected they would move against him first to eliminate the immediate threat, and then they would find some pretext to have humanity expelled from the Concord, or worse. Elias thought about his options and realized that they were few and desperate, and he asked the princess if she would be willing to help him expose the truth about the Meridian to the rest of the galaxy. The question hung in the air between them, like a blade waiting to fall, and Elias could see the conflict in her eyes as she weighed her loyalty to her people against the memory of the child she had held in her arms so long ago. She reminded him that she was heir to the Valanthi throne, and that exposing this secret would destroy her position and possibly her life. And she asked him why she should sacrifice everything she had for a species she barely knew. Elias did not have a logical argument to offer her, no calculation of benefit and cost that would make sense to a mind trained in cold Valanthi reasoning. Instead, he spoke to her about Maya, about the little girl whose love she had carried inside her for more than a century, and he asked her what that child would have wanted her to do. He spoke about the families who had died on the Meridian, the mothers and fathers and children who had been killed simply for being human, and he asked her if their memory deserved to be buried forever beneath lies and silence. And he spoke about the future, about all the humans and Valanthi and other species who would never know the truth about what had happened, who would build their relationships on a foundation of hidden genocide and secret fear. The princess listened to his words, and Elias could see something shifting behind her eyes, a battle being fought in the depths of her ancient mind between what she had been taught and what she had learned from a dying child. Finally, she told him that she would need time to think, and she dismissed him from her chambers with a wave of her silver hand. Elias returned to the human section of the station and spent a sleepless night wondering what the princess would decide and what would happen to him and his people if she chose to remain silent. The answer came sooner than he expected, but not in the way he had hoped. He was walking through a corridor the next morning when 4 Valanthi enforcers surrounded him with weapons drawn, and the leader informed him that he was being detained on charges of espionage and threatening the security of the Volanthi Dominion. Elias did not resist as they bound his hands and led him through the station, because he knew that fighting would only make things worse, and that his only hope now lay in whatever decision the princess had made. They took him to a holding cell in the Volanthi section, and left him there alone in the cold and the dark. And Elias sat on the hard floor and wondered if this was how his story would end. Passed and then days, and Elias lost track of time in the windowless cell, where no light entered and no sound penetrated the thick walls. He thought about Earth and his family and all the things he had left behind when he accepted this mission. And he thought about the 3,000 souls who had died on the Meridian, and wondered if he would soon join them in whatever came after death. And then, on what might have been the 3rd day or the 5th, the door to his cell opened, and light flooded in so bright that he had to shield his eyes. When his vision cleared, he saw the princess standing in the doorway with 2 of her personal guards behind her, and her face was set in an expression that he could not read, but that seemed different from the cold mask she usually wore. She told him to come with her, and Elias rose on unsteady legs, and followed her through corridors filled with Volanthi who stopped and stared as they passed. Dozens of Volanthi had gathered, including several whose robes and bearing marked them as members of the High Council, and Elias felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what was about to happen. But the princess did not lead him to the center of the room to face judgment as he had expected. Instead, she stopped at the entrance and turned to face the assembled Volanthi. And then she did something that made every being in the room gasp in shock. She reached out and took Elias's hand in hers, her silver fingers wrapping around his human flesh in full view of everyone present. And this simple act of contact was the most profound act of rebellion that any Volanthi royal had ever committed. She announced in a voice that rang through the hall like a bell that she would be providing testimony to the Galactic Concord about the massacre of the human colony ship Meridian. And she declared that the truth could no longer be hidden, and that justice would be served, no matter the cost. The members of the High Council erupted in fury and demanded that she release the human and recant her words. But the princess stood firm, with Elias's hand in hers, and refused to back down. She told them that she had carried a human soul inside her for 152 years, and that Maya's memory would not allow her to remain silent, while their people committed another atrocity against innocence. And as the hall dissolved into chaos around them, Elias looked at the princess and saw something he had never expected to see on a Volanthi face. The trial before the Galactic Concord was the most watched event in the history of the known universe, and beings from every corner of the galaxy gathered on Convergence Prime to witness the testimony that would change everything. The great assembly hall was filled beyond capacity, with representatives from over 200 species, and holographic projectors carried the proceedings to countless worlds where billions watched and waited to learn the truth. Princess Cyravel stood at the center of the crystal platform where she had once welcomed humanity into the Concord, but now she stood as an accuser rather than a host, and her violet eyes swept across the assembled delegates, with a fire that no one had ever seen in a Volanthi before. The members of the High Council sat in their appointed seats with expressions of cold fury on their silver faces, and they had brought their finest legal minds to defend against the charges. But Elias could see the fear beneath their faces, masks, and he knew that they understood their time of secrets was ending. The princess began her testimony by describing the emotional integration studies and her participation as a young subject, and she explained how the Volanthi had discovered the overwhelming power of human emotions and had deemed them a threat to their entire species. She told the assembly about the ESS Meridian, and the 3,000 colonists who had entered Volanthi space seeking nothing more than a new home for their families. And she described how the High Council had ordered their destruction rather than risk exposure to human feelings. The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the hall grew louder as the princess continued her account, and Elias watched the faces of the alien delegates shift from skepticism to horror as the full scope of the massacre became clear. And then the princess told them about Maya. She described the little girl she had found in the wreckage, alone and dying, and reaching out for someone to hold her in her final moments. And she spoke of the flood of emotion that had poured into her when she took the child in her arms. Her voice grew thick as she recounted Maya's last thoughts, the memories of love and warmth and family that had filled the dying girl's mind. And Elias saw that even the most hardened diplomats in the hall were moved by her words. For 152 years, the princess declared, I have carried this human child within me, and her love has been my constant companion through all the empty years of my life. I was taught that emotion was weakness, and that feeling was contamination, she said, but Maya showed me that I had been taught lies. Human love is not a poison to be feared, but a gift to be cherished, she proclaimed, and her voice rose to fill every corner of the vast hall. And it is stronger than any force in the galaxy, because it does not diminish when it is shared, but grows ever. The Volanthi did not destroy the Meridian because humans were dangerous, she continued, but because we were afraid that their capacity for feeling would show us how empty our own lives had become. She turned to face the High Council directly, and her violet eyes blazed with the fire of 152 years of suppressed grief and rage. You killed 3,000 innocent people to protect a lie, she accused them. And then you built our entire relationship with humanity on the foundation of that lie. And I will not be silent any longer while you prepare to harm them again. The High Council's chief defender rose to challenge her testimony, and demanded evidence beyond the word of a single witness. And for a moment, it seemed that the princess might falter. But then Elias stepped forward and presented the data chip that the defector Keth Moran had given him, and the files it contained were projected for all to see, the classified documents, and hidden communications that proved everything the princess had said. The hall erupted into chaos as the truth became undeniable, and the representatives of 100 species demanded justice for the humans who had been killed and accountability for those who had ordered their deaths. The trial lasted for 17 days as witness after witness came forward, and the full scope of the Volanthi deception was revealed. And at the end, the Galactic Concord issued a verdict that echoed across the stars. The High Council was found guilty of genocide and conspiracy to cover up their crimes, and they were stripped of their positions and sentenced to exile on a barren world at the edge of known space. Reparations were ordered to be paid to humanity, not in credits or resources, but in the form of full diplomatic recognition and a permanent seat on the Concord's governing body. And the truth about the Meridian was broadcast to every world in the galaxy. Thousands who had died would never be forgotten again. In the months that followed, the Volanthi Dominion underwent changes that had seemed impossible just a year before, as the princess's testimony sparked a revolution in thinking among her people. A reformist movement arose that questioned the ancient teachings of emotional suppression, and young Volanthi began to experiment with feeling for the first time, reaching out to other species and discovering the connections that had been denied to them for millions of years. The princess renounced her claim to the throne and became the leader of this movement, traveling from world to world to share the story of Maya and the lesson she had learned from a dying human child. Elias returned to Earth as a hero, but he found that the fame and recognition meant little to him compared to what he had witnessed and experienced during his time among the stars. He kept in contact with the princess as the years passed. Their friendship deepened into something that neither of them had expected, but both of them treasured. 1 year after the trial, Elias traveled to the site where the Meridian had been destroyed, where the Concord had built a memorial to honor the 3,000 who had died. The princess was there waiting for him, standing before a wall of crystal on which every name of every victim had been inscribed in letters of light. They stood together in silence for a long time, looking up at the names and thinking about the lives that had been cut short, and the ripples that those lives had sent out across the galaxy. Finally, the princess spoke and told Elias that she had made a decision, that she wanted to do something to honor Maya's memory in a way that would last forever. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed deeply, just as Elias had done at the ceremony that had started everything. And when she rose, there were tears streaming down her silver face. But she was smiling. "I carry her with me," she said, "and I always will. And now I want the rest of the galaxy to carry her too." Elias nodded and placed his own hand over his heart. And in that moment he understood that this was what humanity had truly given to the galaxy. Not technology, or military power, or economic might. They had given the gift of feeling, the capacity to love so fiercely that it could survive death itself, and transform even the coldest heart into something warm and alive. And as the memorial lights flickered around them like stars being born, Elias knew that Maya's love had not died with her in that emergency pod 153 years ago. It had grown and spread and touched the lives of beings across the galaxy, and it would continue to grow for as long as there were hearts capable of feeling it. The frozen star had learned to burn, and her light would never go out again.